Okay.
Are we ready?
It's 8 o'clock. Let's start the party. Although Pam and I started about 2 hours ago, so we're loose and ready to answer your questions.
We're good to go.
Okay, I can't listen.
I know we can't.
We have about 25 questions that we're going to try and answer tonight. But I am also manning the chat, so if you see me looking over here, I'm checking in on your chat. And hi, everybody. We're happy to have you. Thanks so much for coming. And hopefully if this goes well, we'll have plenty more. So I'm Dr. Leonard. I am the study doctor for the CDGEMM Study. This is...
I'm Pam Cureton. I'm the dietitian working with the Center for Celiac Research and Treatment. So working alongside Dr. Leonard and Dr. Fasano. So we're here to answer all kinds of questions. So we hope we've got some good ones here. So we hope to get to those questions. We hope you've got some more good ones for us coming. So we're going to try and hopefully answer all your questions tonight.
All right. So I'm going to get started by... we grouped a couple of questions together, so I'm going to start by answering all of the very direct sort of study-related questions. And the first question that came in was that, are we looking at this study in conjunction with what we learned from the previous study, or does this study completely stand alone? So this study is based on the previous study. So in 2014, results of an infant study from Italy were published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that study followed infants, much like this study, at risk for celiac disease. But it only followed those infants that had a genetic compatibility with celiac disease and those who had a first-degree family member. So this study that we're doing is slightly different because we're studying all infants that have a first-degree family member with celiac disease, whether they have the genetic compatibility or not. And then, of course, we're getting a lot more data. So we're getting a ton more clinical information, a ton more biological information in terms of the serum and the poop. But we based a lot of the study basics on what we learned from that Italian cohort. And we're also still learning from that Italian cohort. So some of the things that we found out about the microbiome in that study, we have PhDs working on right now and sort of trying to learn about the mechanism, such that if we find something similar here in the US, then we already have a head start on trying to figure out how certain microbes might contribute to the development of celiac disease. So I would say it's different, it's much more comprehensive, but it's absolutely building on what we've learned, and hopefully we can compare some of our findings to them. Let's see. So we know that we're doing this study so far, and we say we're going to follow you for 5 years, and the NIH has granted funding for that in a couple of different ways, which is very exciting. But our hope is that in a couple of years, we'll apply for more grants and that we will extend the study. So we hope to follow these GEM babies for quite a long time. And that's because some of these infants, unfortunately, will develop celiac disease, and some of them will do so by age 5. But we know that we have so much to learn about celiac disease. And we don't now know, we don't understand the natural history. So is there a peak at some age that we should then begin testing? Or does it happen sort of at all different times? These are all things we hope to learn. So our goal here at Mass General is to, we have funding to follow you guys for 5 years. And then our goal is always to get data, learn a lot, and then apply for more funding so we can keep going.
So I think we're trying to figure out what triggers it, why some people get it, why some people don't. So down the road, we'll have those answers to prevent celiac disease. So that would be very exciting. So you're contributing to that goal.
Yeah, and that's why one of the really exciting things is following the infants that don't have the genetic compatibility to develop celiac disease, because no study has done that before. So we are going to be able to look at exactly what's different between kids that have celiac disease, or kids that can develop celiac disease, and kids that cannot develop celiac disease. So everybody who's participating in this study is super important.
So I think one of the questions was about the genetic compatibility. If you had no genes, would you never ever get it, or what those genes are. So if you have no genes whatsoever, would you ever develop celiac disease? Is that?
Yeah, so if you do not carry the gene for celiac disease, there's no chance that you can develop celiac disease. So there are exceptions to every rule. So we say there's about a 0.01% chance of developing celiac disease, but essentially, no. If you do not have the genes, you cannot develop celiac disease. And that's why these infants make such a sort of important control aspect of the study, because everything else about them is very similar to the kids that do develop celiac disease. They're in the same home environment. They have the same exposures. So we are going to learn exactly how much genes and environment contribute to celiac disease.
What the triggers might be. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to answer the couple more study-specific questions before we talk a little bit about gluten exposure and things like that. So a couple of questions about what are we doing with the samples. So when you send a sample in, we take it, we put it into a system so we know exactly where in a freezer it is, and we process it if it's blood, and we put it pretty much directly in the freezer if it's poop. In the stool samples, we are not testing for infection or anything like that. Currently, what we're doing with the stool samples is we're holding on to them, and then we're doing microbiome. We're looking at the microbiome, and we have to look at it in groups because there's a lot of different factors that can affect the microbiome, and we don't want conditions in the lab to alter our findings at all. So we group them all, and then we run them at a specific time point. So we have sent off, it's very exciting, stools from many of the infants over the first 3 months of age, and we are going to be talking about the analysis in this month, next month. So we are going to have our first results from the CDGEMM study, I hope this spring, and that is going to be very exciting. We eventually will be using these stool studies also to hopefully look for biomarkers, so to look for signals that someone might go on to develop celiac disease. So right now we're taking most of the samples and holding on to them. We are obviously running genetic tests and looking for celiac disease with the serology. And then we're looking at the microbiome, but we, again, sort of group them in large chunks. So, yeah, so that's what we're doing the samples. So I'm going to check in on the chat, and then we're going to move towards some
nutrition diet type of diet questions. So we have a couple here, and if you have other questions as we go along, let us know. There are several questions about cross-contact contamination, and one of them specifically, does a dishwasher get the gluten out? Do I have to use separate cleaning, or what kind of cleaning supplies? So the way I explain it is that we're dealing with food particles. We're not dealing with bacteria. So we're not trying to cover salmonella. So if you have a raw chicken on your counter, of course, then you have to get the bacteria out, and you have to try and kill these salmonella bacteria. This is not what we're dealing with celiac disease. So we're dealing with food particles. So you want to make sure everything is cleaned, rinsed, soap and water. We're not trying to just, to sanitize. We're trying to remove any remaining gluten that may be on the product. So again, just good cleaning. Just wash everything well. You don't have to have separate pots, pans, all of those things. Separate toaster is needed because your crumbs do sit in the toast would sit in the breadcrumbs. But other than that, just good basic washing. So
dishwashers.
Right. So again, just good cleaning. Good cleaning. You don't have to, I tell people you have to be thoughtful. You have to plan, but I don't want you paranoid or fearful. Again, just common sense, good cleaning will help with that. So those kinds of things. Then a little bit about the introduction of gluten into the diet. And I think there's been enough studies done to show that there used to be considered a window that you had to introduce gluten between 4 and 6 months. If you did it too early or too late, that increased the risk. And we did not, through these earlier studies, that this was not the case. So there isn't a magic window that you have to introduce gluten in. So we follow the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines for introducing foods the same that we would for kids not at risk of celiac disease. To begin to introduce those foods to kids, to put it in their diet. So there's no reason to restrict or withhold gluten for a year or anything else. In general, the whole thinking about allergens, which again, celiac disease, as we all know, is not an allergy; it's an autoimmune condition, so it's an autoimmune disease. It's not an allergy. But there were some questions here about allergens. So you may be aware of recent studies about, even for peanuts, that they're saying that maybe we got this wrong. Instead of delaying the introduction of peanuts, we need to introduce it early. So the microbiome have a chance to see this and say, oh, okay, now this is not an invader. This is an okay thing. So we're not going to have an allergic reaction to it. So if anything, these studies are looking more for early introduction rather than delayed introduction. And I know there was a specific question about one recommendation may have been to withhold all solids. And I may be reading this wrong without my glasses here, that you delay all introduction of food until 1 year. And I do not recommend this whatsoever. So formula or breast milk is fine for the first 6 months, but then we do need to introduce solids into the diet, not only nutritionally, but also just for motor skills. Kids need to eat. They need to develop those motor skills. They need to eat. They need to get the digestive system running and up and running. So withholding food for the first year is not what we would consider medically necessary.
And everything that sort of we're learning in allergy research is that the more proteins that an infant is introduced to at an early age, the better. So we really want to offer as many foods as possible, after 4 months. And again, it's different. Celiac disease is not an allergy. So there was a study also in 2014 that gave tiny amounts of gluten to kids to see if they would have a decreased chance of developing celiac disease. Again, these are kids at risk. They have a family member. They have the genetic predisposition. They didn't find that there was any difference in the kids that were fed the tiny amounts versus none. But overall, we think that the more proteins, the more foods that an infant is exposed to, the more that their immune system sees, and the higher chance that they'll be able to tolerate those things. So we certainly want to encourage people to introduce solid foods. And we usually say, the way that the American Academy of Pediatrics suggests. So that means
exactly there's no difference, right? So
once every,
again, they recommend fully exclusively breastfeeding, or again, if you can't breastfeed, then bottle feeding for 6 months, and then the introduction of food. There's some talk about what you introduce first, and really you're looking at what nutrients do the babies need, and one of the things that they need is iron, because their iron stores are depleted after about 6 months, and breast milk can be low in iron. So starting with iron fortified cereals is generally the traditional way to proceed, with the rice fortified cereals.
But you can do meats too.
But some physicians are saying, well, wait a minute, if we need iron, we need a good source of iron, so let's introduce the meats first. So let's start with the meats and then move on to fruits and vegetables and those types of things. So really, Dr. Leonard saying, you need a variety of foods. The microbiome loves a lot of healthy whole grains, diversity, lots of vegetables and fruits, and those are the things that are going to build a healthy gut.
Yep.
Wow.
Wow.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, we have one that will say someone is saying that their son was diagnosed with milk soy protein intolerance, and they want to wait. Someone suggested to wait a year to introduce dairy, soy, and gluten. So I would say I'm going to disagree with that.
Yeah. So if you're diagnosed with, through some have endoscopies, and we've got the eosinophils that, is that what they're
No, this
diagnosis?
this sounds like a milk soy protein intolerance. I'm going to say it's an infant, less than a year. So for one, I would say there's no need to not introduce gluten. That doesn't have anything to do with the milk and soy intolerance. And then two, so I would say introduce gluten. And then two, what we do at Mass General, and everybody does it a little differently, sometimes there's the art of medicine, is that we generally give it another try. So if your infant is close to 6 months, depending on when this happened, so if they've been doing well for 2 months or so, we generally suggest introducing a tiny amount of milk in the form of either like a baby yogurt, or it could be baked milk, or a little teeny bit of cheese, or just a little bit of cow's milk formula. And we usually try it at 6 months. And if there are symptoms like blood in the stool, or terrible rash, but really if it's a little bit of diarrhea, we keep going. And then if that doesn't work, we try it again at 9 months. So our goal is really to try and get that protein back into the diet. This is not, I'm saying this for cow's milk protein intolerance and not for an anaphylactic reaction. That is completely different, and that should be managed by an allergist. But if you have a cow's milk protein intolerance, again, everybody does it different. I would say a couple of years ago, we said don't try it again until 1 year of age. But now the research shows that the sooner that you get those proteins back into the infant, the higher chance that they're going to tolerate more protein. So we try it between 6 and 9 months, and we try every couple months to get that protein back in there.
But just keep in mind that we're kind of mixing apples and oranges here. So we're talking about celiac disease and the gluten versus the protein. So it's the top 8 allergens, and so wheat happens to be one of the top 8 allergens. So sometimes if they do have an allergic reaction that they're looking at, sometimes they do remove some of the top 8 allergens, wheat being one of them for an allergy purpose, not for celiac disease. Right. So again, keep in mind that we're kind of mixing it up and a little bit here.
Cow's milk protein intolerance is not a true IgE mediated allergy. So that's an intolerance, which infants often outgrow. So we're talking about a lot of different things, and it does get complicated. So I would say talk to your doctor, but if it's a cow's milk protein intolerance, there's no need to remove gluten from the diet, and talk to your doctor about seeing if you can do a very sort of light milk challenge sooner rather than later. Question coming in about blood in the stool and a rash by 6 weeks with milk and soy allergy. And whether that's an autoimmune reaction. As far as we know, it's not an autoimmune reaction, but we don't know yet. We are doing research at Mass General to look into that further. But as of right now, it's not autoimmune, and it's not an IgE-based allergy. We don't know exactly what causes it, but we know that most kids outgrow it, and there's ongoing research. So I'm hopeful that in the next couple of years, we'll be able to tell you sort of exactly what's going on there.
So one of the questions, again, kind of common, does everyone with celiac disease have the same threshold for gluten exposure? And we talk about the 20 parts per million. So sometimes that needs a little bit of explanation as well, how we came up with this 20 parts per million, and how the FDA came up with 20 parts per million. So in studies that have been done, it's been shown that the vast majority of people with celiac disease can tolerate a daily exposure of 10 milligrams per day. So
we're so close.
I know. I can kick you under the table here. So she's going to kick me if I say anything wrong. So how do you distribute that? So we know that 10 milligrams is about the size of 1/8 of a teaspoon of flour. So if you think about that much gluten exposure, the vast majority of people with celiac disease can tolerate that daily exposure. So we take that little bit, 10 milligrams, and now we're going to distribute that throughout the day. So that's going to be sprinkled, if you will, throughout your food. So how much food could you eat before you reach this 10 milligrams a day level? So if your food contains less than 20 parts per million, so again, if you think of 20 grains of sand in a million, in a big pile of sand, that's the level that we're looking at. You could eat over 2 pounds of gluten-free food, so gluten-free pasta, gluten-free bread, gluten-free cereal. Eat over 2 pounds of that, and you would still not get over that 10 milligrams. So we consider the 20 milligrams safe. So, and to back up a little bit, so in Europe, before we passed our laws here, many, many years before, the codex used to be 100 parts per million.
What's the codex?
Codex is the FDA version of standards in Europe.
Got it.
So many countries followed 100 parts per million. And that worked because they didn't eat much of the products. So they didn't eat the 2 pounds. They only ate a pound or a quarter pound. They didn't eat a lot of the gluten-free foods. So they ate less and they had more exposure, but they did not exceed then that 10 milligrams. We do have people that come to us that do follow a very strict gluten-free diet. They follow the rules. They don't eat the whole loaf of bread at one time. So they follow the rules. They're very strict. They're very good about cross-contact. They keep within the frame, but they're still having trouble getting their celiac disease under control. So TTG remains elevated, or they still have symptoms, or they still have damage on biopsy. So that special group, we put on a very special diet, which removes all processed food. So we take any contamination out of the diet. So we take any processed food, including gluten-free food, out of the diet completely. And we give the immune system time to rest. They just have a very active immune system. So what happens after 3 to 4 months on this special diet, their immune system does calm down, their TTG comes down, and they do get gut healing. Then they return to that normal gluten-free diet. So everybody goes back to the normal, if you will, traditional gluten-free diet, which includes those types of products. So I don't think people are more sensitive, than others, because we just don't, and the amount of patients that we see in our clinic, we just find very few that would not be able to tolerate them.
And we know that some people have symptoms when they eat, after going on a gluten-free diet. Some people have symptoms when they eat gluten and some people don't, but that whether you have symptoms or not, that's something, the inflammatory response is still developing in your intestine, and you may not have symptoms for years, or you may have symptoms immediately. So we also see patients in our clinic that come in and say, I was diagnosed with celiac disease, and then I started eating gluten again, and I have felt fine ever since. And then we do labs, and we see that they have vitamin deficiencies up the wazoo, as Dr. Fasano would say. And we do a scope, and it's still there. So if you are cross-contaminated, you may not develop symptoms, but it still could be harmful for your body. So that's why we all have to be so very careful.
And why follow-up is so important. So as Dr. Leonard is saying, you can eat gluten and have no symptoms, or you cannot eat gluten and have symptoms. Sometimes people who don't realize they have a lactose intolerance. So they find a good cereal that they like, and they eat a lot of cereal one morning, and then they're having digestive problems. So gas, bloating, diarrhea, not because they had gluten, but because they have a lactose intolerance and they overdid the lactose. So there's other things that could be at play as well.
Like too much fiber.
Oh, right, exactly.
Remember that? There's a pasta that's made of all beans. I didn't do this, but I've heard that if you eat the whole box, that it's like 3 days worth of fiber, and that can cause gas and bloating.
The body doesn't like that. It doesn't like it when you overdo anything. So it's an excellent product, but don't eat it all in one setting.
Should we? I'm going to answer one question, and then should we talk about probiotics, and then we'll get into genetics. So one question was, will we share the results of what we find out this spring? And the answer is yes. As soon as we get enough information and analyze it, we will share it with you, either probably through one of those updates that we send, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to send that out to you guys as soon as we have any information. And the other question that came in that was on our group, so I'll answer it now, is are we talking to other GI doctors about all of these things and about how to care for patients with celiac disease? And the answer is absolutely. Dr. Fasano and I speak all over the place, as does Pam. We have information on our website, and we're constantly trying to spread the word about sort of best practices for celiac disease. So we're always trying to get the word out, and we're happy to come speak to whoever will listen.
But we talk to anybody who listens to us.
Anybody. Okay. Probiotics.
So would you recommend any particular brand of probiotics? And again, we're not big advocates of probiotics. We don't recommend them a whole lot. Of course, we always start with food. So you always want to start back to what we were talking about earlier. So the healthy foods that feed the microbiome that they really like, they love fruits, vegetables, whole grains. And then things like yogurt, which are and any fermented foods like yogurt or kefir, those are the types of things that help to establish our healthy gut bacteria. But we really, we're kind of on the verge of this. So there's many, many different strains. So it's not just one strain, like this is the good strain and this is the bad strain. There's, all different kinds. And so which one do you feed? Which one do you don't feed? And do you overfeed this one while the other good one isn't getting fed? And then they, suffer. Yeah. We know the microbiome does not like sugary things. They don't like the sugary, simple carbs. Those types of things aren't good for the microbiome. But as far as adding the probiotics, I don't think they're harmful per se, but I don't necessarily recommend them as a replacement for what the basic good eating we should be doing.
Yeah. So I wrote a blog that's going to come out in the next week or two, and we'll post it on the Facebook page about should patients with celiac disease take probiotics. And what I wrote about was sort of some of the research that's been done. And what it looks like is exactly what Pam said. We don't understand enough about the microbiome to know what bugs we should be, putting into our system. We know that having a lot of different microbes is good, and the best way to make sure you have a diverse microbiome is to have a diverse diet. And so that means eating things that are natural prebiotics and natural probiotics. So just like she said, kefir, yogurt, prebiotics are like chicory. There's lists out there, and so we don't often recommend probiotics because there are a couple of strains, 1 to 8 strains, and we don't know what overwhelming our system with 1 to 8 strains is going to do. What if there's like a little group of microbes that are so important, but when you give a whole bunch of lactobacillus GG, it's probably not going to happen. But what if those go away? We just don't know yet. So I would say eat a healthy, diverse diet. And there's no need to supplement with probiotics until we have any research that shows that it's helpful. Okay. So this blog is coming out on Kevin MD and maybe in the HuffPost. So I'll make sure to send it onto the Facebook group and maybe come up with a blog eventually. But right now there's no website for it because I just do it sporadically. Okay. Want to talk a little bit about genetics, and then we can talk about some treatments that are in the pipeline for celiac disease, because I was trying to answer a couple more questions. Yep. What do you think? Okay. Yep. So let's get to some genetics, because I know a lot of genetic tests went out and there were a lot of questions. So we already said if you don't carry the gene for celiac disease, you essentially cannot develop celiac disease. If your infant has the genetic markers for celiac disease, I will say that was expected. That's why you're in the study. We know that at least 75% of infants born to a family with celiac disease will carry one or both of the genetic markers. We also know that at least 40% of the population in the United States carries one of the genetic markers. But the majority of people with these genetic markers don't develop celiac disease. So if 40% of the population carries one of these genetic markers, only that 2 or 3% actually go on to develop celiac disease. And so that's what we're trying to figure out with this study is what pushes those 2 or 3% into developing celiac disease. The genetics are so important. They're absolutely necessary in order to develop the disease, but there's has to be some other really important things to decide why 3% go on to develop celiac disease. So right now, the research that's out there really shows that kids who develop celiac disease, when we follow them prospectively like we're doing, so when we test every couple of years for celiac disease, we pick them up, and that they don't often have, like, sometimes they have the typical symptoms, but not always. So one of the questions is, so what should you watch out for? I would say you want to watch out for any sort of change in growth. So if the child isn't growing as well as they usually are, but otherwise, if right now, if there's a family history of celiac disease, we need to test every couple of years. So that's covered by being in this study. But for other kids, we usually say every 3 years or so, maybe like age 3, 6, and then 9 before puberty starts, and then you could go every couple of years after that.
Yeah, I kind of say too, if you're going to do blood work, throw a TTG in. You know, if you're doing blood work for, if you automatically do lead testing or iron or regular physical, whatever you're doing blood for, throw a TTG in. And it does not matter about symptoms. So we have seen children in clinic who the brother was diagnosed with celiac disease, classic. You know, he had the GI symptoms, the stunting, the growth, all this kind of stuff. His brother, on the other hand, he was tall, he was growing well, great appetite, no GI symptoms. No physician would ever think of celiac disease taking a look at this kid. But because his brother was diagnosed with celiac disease, he was screened. Sure enough, TTG is over 100 MARS3C on the endoscopy. So he hadn't progressed to where he had symptoms, and the damage had progressed to the point where he was having problems, but he definitely had problems with celiac disease. So sometimes physicians say, well, we don't need to test because you don't have any symptoms, or you don't have any. But,
right.
But again, keep in mind this can occur at any stage. Parents should be screened. So every couple of years, again, if you're in for your physical and you're doing a cholesterol test, throw a TTG in. It's not. I'm not asking for an endoscopy every year. Just a simple TTG will do.
Right. So a couple other genetic tests. So again, so for every child that is in a family with celiac disease, there's a 75% chance that they'll carry one or both HLA-DQ2 or DQ8, that they'll be at risk. Again, that information comes from Italy. We expect it to be the same here, and that's essentially what we found with the first 100 GEMMs that we've looked at. You can have genetic testing done for other kids not in this study. Generally, I think it's difficult for pediatricians to send, but they possibly could, and pediatric gastroenterologists can send it as well. Right now, it's not covered by insurance.
Not always. You just have to.
Right, but for infants who's otherwise.
Yeah, just be careful before you get the test done, depending on where you do it and who does it. Just be sure ahead of time if your insurance is going to cover it. I think some insurance companies are doing better, but it can be up to $1,000, and who wants $1,000 surprise?
Yeah.
So just be sure that if it's covered or not.
I've only heard of insurances covering it lately if there's a positive TTG, a positive blood test, and a negative endoscopy, or vice versa, a positive endoscopy and a negative blood test. They'll cover it when test findings are discrepant, but I have not seen them cover it in other ways. So you're looking at about $1,000. Let's see. And let me ask about, again, I think we touched on what ages should we test children for the antibodies for celiac disease. Again, we said every 3 years or so, whenever they're getting blood work.
Or if anything unusual is happening.
Yeah. And then someone asked whether we can test for celiac disease or gluten intolerance in the stool, and we cannot. There's no stool test for celiac disease that is validated, period. I think there are some out there. I don't know what they're testing. We don't have any that would do that. We are working with some cool companies to try and be able to monitor whether you've been exposed to gluten through the urine or poop. And so that's going to be exciting, but right now there's no way to test for celiac disease in the poop. And what we're doing is we're looking at the microbiome to look for signals that might tell us that someone is going to develop celiac disease.
And there is no biomarker at all for gluten intolerance. So while we're on that subject, so unfortunately we have no biomarker for gluten. So you may not have celiac disease, but somebody in the family may be gluten sensitive. They just can't tolerate gluten. It's unfortunately at this point a rule out. So if we know you don't have celiac disease, we know you don't have a wheat allergy, but you really cannot eat gluten without symptoms, that's our only diagnostic criteria at this point. So please, a lot of labs will say, I've even seen where they'll test for the gene for gluten intolerance, and that's news to me because I didn't think we had one. Or you know, or another the gluten intolerance gene.
I was like, well, they're doing special gene testing in the lab for zonulin genetics, but that's different. That's intestinal permeability. That's different.
We're not right. That's not right. Exactly.
Okay, I want to come back to probiotics for a minute because I said that we don't suggest probiotics for patients with celiac disease, but there are, and that's kind of going based on strict evidence. Again, we don't think that they're harmful, but we don't know that they're helpful, and for that reason, I tend to stay away from them. But there are studies that show that if your child is on antibiotics, that starting a probiotic at the same time is helpful to decrease the length of time of antibiotic-associated diarrhea. So that's a direct proven relationship. So I can see I would say that you should use that if your child goes on antibiotics, or you can consider that it's fine to do so. Sometimes I tell patients to just increase the yogurt or kefir and do it in that sense. But probiotics are helpful when a child or anyone is on antibiotics. Probiotics have been shown to be helpful if you are a woman in your 3rd trimester of pregnancy and you have children that have asthma or atopy, eczema. So taking lactobacillus GG in the 3rd trimester can possibly decrease the chance of eczema in your child, at least for a short time. And then there's one other study that shows that if you have ulcerative colitis, which is a type of inflammatory bowel disease, and you have a specific inflammation in a certain part of your colon, then taking BSL number 3 is helpful. So again, there are studies that are coming out and finding that specific strains may be helpful for specific diseases or conditions, but we don't have any of that information for celiac disease. And we do sometimes have some studies that show that even if you take one of the celiac studies that came out showed that when they looked at the microbiome of people that took the probiotic versus the ones that did not, there was no difference. So they thought that particular probiotic didn't make it through the acid of the stomach. So that's why I just think it's early to.
And they're not just a temporary thing, though. I mean, it is for a condition like if you have the diarrhea, but if once you stop taking them, then whatever you're feeding, bye. So we're
as Tori would say, girl, bye.
So
okay, maybe I say that. Okay. The test for doing a TTG every 3 years or so should be covered by insurance. Okay, I think we answered the genetic questions. Unless, I think we answered the genetic questions and the study-related questions. Probiotics. I'm going to look over here. Do you want to touch on any of those? Someone asked about whether there's any data on celiac disease and correlation with ADHD. So there's one study that looked at celiac disease and ADHD. It didn't find any correlation. I think that we sometimes look for nutritional deficiencies in kids with celiac disease to see whether that might be affecting behavior. And so certainly a child with undiagnosed celiac disease or recently diagnosed celiac disease could, I think, not necessarily have a relationship with ADHD, but could have some difficulties in school, and that's because they don't feel well. So that could be misconstrued as ADHD. And so I think if there are behavior changes, one of the things that you want to consider is, could this be related to celiac disease?
There is a question about vaccinations too with the celiac disease, and we do highly recommend all the vaccines. So please, even flu vaccines, all the vaccines. There's no reason. Some people think because you have a compromised immune system, you shouldn't get vaccines. No, you definitely need. We definitely recommend all the vaccines. So keep all the vaccines.
And there were new recommendations out this year that if you have celiac disease, that you should have your status to hepatitis B checked, because you might not have mounted an immune response to hepatitis B. So that's for all of our celiac patients that haven't had that done recently. We're doing that, and that's part of the new diagnosis workup at this time. So just pass that on to your friends and family that you might need your hepatitis B status checked.
There you go. I didn't know. Breast milk versus formulas. Again, breast milk is best. We will always recommend breastfeeding. Unfortunately, it did not have the protective factor that some of the earlier studies thought it did. So we thought by introducing gluten at the same time as breastfeeding would offer a protective factor. It did not. So although breast milk has numerous beneficial things for kids, and we highly recommend breastfeeding, it does not help prevent celiac disease.
Okay, one thing before we can end, maybe I'll just tell you a little update on treatments in the works for celiac disease, or some new cool stuff coming out. But one thing that I do want to get across about the celiac disease testing, about the TTG and the DGP and all the serology blood tests for celiac disease, every lab has a different cutoff. So sometimes a positive TTG is 4, and sometimes it's 16, and sometimes it's 22. So every lab makes a different cutoff. So we really just look at whether it's positive or negative, and then we want to know sometimes how high it is. That's not always that helpful, except if it's greater than 10 times the upper limit of normal, we think that's pretty high.
That's pretty high.
There's cutoffs that are positive, and they're different. Look at your hands going over there. And it's different based on the lab. That means when it's negative, after it's negative, we don't care about the number. So if it's 0 versus, if the cutoff is 15, so above 15 is positive, whether the number is 2, 0, 8, 12.2, none of that matters. That's all negative. And that's because the way that the tests are validated in the lab just means that we can only know that something's true above the cutoff. So please don't, if you get results from us and the cutoff is 15 and it's 13 and the last time it was 2, that does not mean that your infant or your child or anybody is headed towards celiac disease. The same is true as if you have celiac disease and you are tested every year with your TTG, and one time it was 12 and the next time it's 12.5. That does not mean you are exposed to gluten. The lab tests they have to find a cutoff for where they're validated, for where we can say we trust the results, and anything below that is just negative. So please don't look at that number and draw conclusions from that, because we can't. That's why positive or negative. So one is, what do we recommend for follow-up after a gluten-free diet? So for kids 10 and older, kids and adults, after 1 year on a strict gluten-free diet, at Mass General, we're recommending repeating an endoscopy between 1 and 2 years and doing blood tests at the same time. If the blood test and the endoscopy are normal, meaning there's no damage, celiac disease in remission, we'll follow a TTG every year right now. And that's only because even though we don't think it's very helpful, if it were to go up, we would be concerned. We also want to follow growth, how you're feeling, and nutritional parameters. We don't recommend any more than 1 endoscopy unless something changes, whether that's your symptoms or your TTG. So you should be seeing a gastroenterologist and a dietitian yearly to check in on how you're doing.
I think, yeah, if any adults that are have been diagnosed with celiac disease, again, it's within the last, I'd say 4 or 5 years that we're recommending this follow-up endoscopy. So if you were diagnosed 10 years ago, you probably never had that repeat endoscopy, but studies are really showing that even though you have a negative TTG and your symptoms may resolve, you still may have intestinal damage. So I think it's the recommendation we're making for everybody, as you said, over the age 10, to get that repeat endoscopy to verify that your celiac disease is under good control and in remission.
Yeah. All right, so we'll wrap up. If there's any burning questions, send it in now. But I'll wrap up by saying, right now there's no cure for celiac disease. It's an autoimmune disease that can be put into remission, meaning symptoms should go away, blood tests should return to normal, intestinal damage should go away if someone, in the most cases, is on a strict gluten-free diet. We're finding through research that anywhere up to 30% of patients with celiac disease may still have symptoms or signs of celiac disease, or they may even have intestinal damage in the small intestine, despite being on a gluten-free diet and doing their very best. So people are now, more and more researchers and industry are looking really to move towards looking at biomarkers. So can we look for intestinal damage without doing an endoscopy? So that's something we're looking at too. Right now, our studies have to include the endoscopy because that's sort of our gold standard, but we are taking urine and poop and blood and questions, and we'll take anything to try and see, can we find a marker in the urine or the poop that tells us that there's still intestinal damage or someone's been exposed to gluten, so that someday we don't have to do endoscopies. So that would be something exciting. There are a couple of different industry people that are looking into different possible treatments for celiac disease. There was an enzyme that was trying to digest gluten before it got to the small intestine. As you guys probably know, no one can completely digest gluten. So there's been lots of different mixes of enzymes that try and digest it completely before it gets to the small intestine. That one came out maybe a month ago that it failed. It's very hard to digest gluten, and these people have worked on it out a decade. So if you see something on the market right now,
so don't because
it doesn't work.
Something. Oh, please, please,
it doesn't work because
it does not work. And I think it's very dangerous to even have the notion that it may help you. Unfortunately, those do not work. So I don't know how they get away with it. I don't know how they can make these claims, but please don't use those.
Don't use this. Okay. The only thing that is right now in phase 3 trials is actually Dr. Fasano's discovery, which is a pill that would be taken, seems like with any meal. And what it does is it prevents the tight junctions from opening. So
who's getting tight?
Blah, blah, blah.
No, I can't do that, but now you're going to do tight junctions.
When you eat gluten, it causes leakiness in your small intestine, and his drug would prevent that leakiness. If there's no increase in leakiness, then the gluten can't get from the small intestine into the underlying tissue and cause this inflammatory reaction. So that is a medication that is going into phase 3 trials. It's furthest along. It's very exciting, except, and I'm saying this because I'm honest, that you would have to take it before each meal, and it's only if you are accidentally cross-contaminated.
So you can't go out
tiny amount.
You eat a pizza and beer.
Not a pizzeria, Regina pizza. You can have New Grist beer, and you can have your Against the Grain pizza, but then you don't need to take that. But there's nothing.
But in case they, mix it up and put it on the wrong pan or something.
Yeah.
So it's for minor cross contact.
Minor cross contact. There's also a vaccine that they're looking into. That's very, very early. It's like preclinical. It's very early, so I wouldn't expect anything for many years. That is only for patients that carry HLA-DQ2, not DQ8 and DQ2.5. So it's for a subset of patients, but again, it's very early. So there's always some new stuff that seems exciting, but right now there's one pill going into phase 3 studies. We should hear about that, I would say 2 years.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the first one. So that's why CDGEMM is so important, because while there's no cure and while there's treatments that people are studying, if we can learn what happens before someone develops celiac disease, our hope is that we can then take the knowledge that we learn here and then in our next cohort study, take that knowledge and prevent it. And that wouldn't be a cure, it would be ultimately preventing celiac disease, and hopefully what we learn will also be able to be applied to things like type 1 diabetes, thyroid disease, MS, all other autoimmune diseases. All right, I'd like to say thanks, Kevin, for the tight junction shout out. I don't know what UW stands for, but I'm happy to discuss that further via the CDGEMM email. All right, if there's no other questions, I gotta go to bed, and Pam and I have spent a lot of time together. Oh my gosh, we're gonna spend all day together tomorrow. Okay. Just kidding.
Thank you for all your support.
Thanks for coming. Thank you so much for being part of the study. I hope you know how much this means to us. I have you guys are going to get this too, but I have my GEM. This is my progress report up here on my wall, because I'm going on 5 years of working on this study, and it's just so important to us, and we're so thankful that you're in it. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
I think you have to